You know that feeling when your child comes home and something is deeply, terribly wrong, but they beg you not to ask questions. You see the pain in their eyes, the way they hold themselves like they are trying to keep from falling apart, and every instinct in your body screams at you to protect them, to fix it, to make it right. But they look at you with those pleading eyes and whisper, "Please, please, do not ask." And you are torn between respecting their wishes and the overwhelming need to know what has hurt the person you brought into this world. You have spent your entire life putting their needs first, sacrificing everything so they could have a better future, and now they are standing in front of you, broken and bruised in ways you cannot quite see, asking you to pretend you do not notice. Today, I am going to share with you a story about a mother who faced that impossible choice, who had to decide between the silence her daughter begged for and the truth that could change everything. What she discovered when she finally made that phone call will shake you to your core, and it might just give you the courage to trust your own instincts when it matters most. I am Patricia. I am 68 years old, and I will never forget the night my daughter came home 3 weeks after her wedding with bruises on her arms and terror in her eyes. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and I had just finished cleaning up after a quiet dinner alone in my house in suburban Philadelphia. My husband Richard had passed away 4 years earlier, and I had grown accustomed to the silence of an empty home, though I never quite made peace with it. The grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck 8 when I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway, and something about the way the headlights swept across my living room curtains made my heart skip a beat. I was not expecting anyone. My daughter Jessica had married Marcus Thompson 3 weeks ago in what everyone called the wedding of the year, a lavish ceremony at the country club that had cost more money than I had ever seen in my entire life, paid for entirely by Marcus and his wealthy family. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to see Jessica's silver sedan parked crookedly in my driveway, one wheel on the grass, the engine still running. That was my first sign that something was wrong. Jessica was meticulous about everything, from the way she folded her towels to the way she parked her car, and seeing that vehicle sitting there at that careless angle sent a chill down my spine that I still feel when I think about it today. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, wrapping my cardigan tighter around my shoulders against the October chill. The leaves on my maple tree had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, and they scattered across my lawn in the evening breeze like nature's confetti. But I barely noticed them because my attention was fixed on my daughter's car, on the shadow I could see hunched over the steering wheel, on the way her shoulders were shaking. I called out her name, but she did not respond. I walked down the porch steps, my slippers crunching on the fallen leaves, and as I got closer to the car, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. She was crying. Not the gentle crying of someone who had a bad day at work or watched a sad movie, but the deep, guttural sobbing of someone whose world had shattered into a million pieces. I knocked on the driver's side window, and when she finally looked up at me, I had to grab onto the car door to keep myself from collapsing. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, a purple bruise spreading across her cheekbone like spilled ink on paper. There was a cut on her lip that had only recently stopped bleeding, and her beautiful honey blonde hair, the hair I used to brush every night when she was a little girl, was tangled and matted on one side as if someone had grabbed it and pulled. My daughter, my baby girl, my Jessica, who I had carried for 9 months and raised for 32 years, looked at me through that car window with an expression of such profound shame and fear that I felt my heart crack right down the middle. I opened the car door and reached for her, but she flinched away from my touch like I was going to hurt her. That flinch told me more than any words could have. Someone had taught my daughter to be afraid of hands reaching toward her, and that someone had done it recently enough that the lesson was still fresh. I crouched down beside the open car door, ignoring the pain in my knees, and I spoke to her in the same soft voice I used when she was 5 years old and had nightmares about monsters under her bed. I told her she was safe, that she was home, that nothing and no one was going to hurt her while I was there. It took almost 10 minutes before she finally let me help her out of the car, and when she stood up, I saw that she was limping. She was wearing a long-sleeved sweater, despite the fact that it was still relatively mild outside. And when the fabric shifted as she moved, I caught a glimpse of more bruises on her wrists. They were the kind of bruises that come from being grabbed too hard, from being held down, from being restrained. I had seen bruises like that before, 35 years ago, on a woman who used to live 3 houses down from us. That woman had a husband who everyone said was such a nice man, so charming, so successful. That woman moved away one night and never came back, and 6 months later, we heard she had died. The official report said it was an accident, but everyone in the neighborhood knew the truth. We just never talked about it. I got Jessica inside and sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where she had done her homework as a child, where we had celebrated birthdays and Thanksgivings, where she had told me she was getting married to Marcus Thompson with stars in her eyes and excitement in her voice. I put the kettle on because that is what mothers do when they do not know what else to do, and I gathered every ounce of strength I had to keep my voice calm and steady when I asked her what happened. She looked up at me with those swollen, tear-filled eyes, and she said 5 words that I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. She said, "Please, Mom, do not ask." She said it like she was begging, like my question was somehow more dangerous than whatever had put those bruises on her face. She said, "Please do not ask." And then she said, "Please do not call anyone." And then she said, "Please just let me stay here tonight." I wanted to scream. I wanted to get in my car and drive to the expensive house in the gated community where my daughter was supposed to be living happily ever after with her new husband. I wanted to find Marcus Thompson and make him explain why my daughter looked like she had just survived a war. But instead, I did what she asked. I made her tea. I gave her ice for her eye. I helped her into the guest room that used to be her childhood bedroom, and I watched her curl up under the covers like she was trying to make herself as small as possible, like she was trying to disappear. I sat in the chair beside her bed until her breathing finally slowed and deepened into sleep. And then I went back to my kitchen and I cried so hard I thought I might break apart. The next morning, Jessica was different. She came downstairs wearing makeup that almost, but not quite, covered the bruise on her face, and she had a story ready. She told me she had fallen down the stairs at her new house. She said the staircase was unfamiliar, and she had been carrying laundry, and she had simply lost her balance. She said Marcus had wanted to take her to the hospital, but she insisted she was fine. She said she came to stay with me because Marcus was traveling for business and she did not want to be alone in that big house while she was still shaken up. She told me all of this with a smile that never reached her eyes, with a voice that sounded rehearsed, with hands that trembled when she lifted her coffee cup to her lips. I listened to every word of her carefully constructed lie, and I said nothing because I could see in her face that she needed me to believe her, or at least to pretend that I believed her. So I pretended. I told her I understood that stairs could be treacherous, that she should be more careful in the future. I watched her shoulders relax slightly, watched some of the tension drain from her body, and I felt sick to my stomach because I knew that by playing along with her story, I was somehow participating in whatever was happening to her. But I also knew that if I pushed too hard, she would leave. She would go back to that house in the gated community, and I might never see the truth of what was happening behind those expensive walls. Jessica stayed with me for 3 days. During those 3 days, I watched her like a hawk, noting every flinch, every moment of fear that crossed her face when her phone buzzed with a text message every time she looked over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. I noticed that she changed the password on her phone and that she always took her calls in another room with the door closed. I noticed that she wore long sleeves even when we went for a walk and the afternoon sun was warm. I noticed that she jumped at loud noises and that she did not eat much and that she had trouble sleeping, pacing the hallways at 3 in the morning like a ghost haunting her own childhood home. On the second day, Marcos called the house phone to talk to me. His voice was smooth and concerned, dripping with the kind of charm that had made me think he was perfect for my daughter when Jessica first brought him home to meet me. He thanked me for taking care of his wife after her little accident. He said those words, little accident, with a slight emphasis that made my skin crawl. He asked when she would be coming home because he missed her terribly. He said the house felt empty without her laughter. I listened to him and I made appropriate responses, but inside I was cataloging every word, every inflection, every subtle threat wrapped in the language of love. When I hung up the phone, Jessica was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, and the look on her face was one of pure terror. She asked me what he said. She asked me if he was angry. She asked me these questions like a prisoner asking about the mood of her captor, and that was the moment I knew with absolute certainty that my daughter's fall down the stairs had not been an accident. On the third day, Jessica told me she had to go home. She said Marcus was back from his business trip and he needed her. She said she was feeling much better and her bruises were healing nicely. She said all the right words in all the right order, and I watched her pack her overnight bag with hands that trembled so badly she could barely zip it closed. I wanted to throw myself in front of the door. I wanted to lock her in her childhood bedroom and never let her leave. I wanted to call the police, call her friends, call anyone who might be able to stop what I could see unfolding in front of me. But I had been doing research during those 3 days, reading articles and websites about domestic abuse, about why women stay, about how to help without pushing them further into danger. Everything I read said the same thing. You cannot force someone to leave. Pressuring them often makes things worse. The most important thing you can do is let them know you are there, that you believe them, that you will help when they are ready. So I hugged my daughter, careful not to squeeze too hard because I did not know where all the bruises were hidden under her clothes, and I told her that I loved her and that my door was always open. I watched her drive away, and I stood on my porch until her car disappeared around the corner, and then I went inside and I threw up in the kitchen sink. The next 6 months were the longest of my life. Jessica called every Sunday, as she always had, but our conversations were different now. There was a guardedness in her voice, a constant undertone of anxiety that she tried to mask with forced cheerfulness. She told me about the new furniture they bought, about the dinner parties they hosted, about how wonderful Marcus was and how happy she was and how perfect her life had turned out to be. I listened to these stories and I heard the words she was not saying. I heard the hesitation before she answered certain questions. I heard the way her voice dropped to almost a whisper when Marcus came into the room. I heard the code she had developed without realizing it, the subtle signals that told me when she could talk freely and when she could not. I started keeping a journal. Every phone call, every visit, every strange comment or unexplained absence, I wrote it all down. I documented dates and times and the progression of injuries I managed to glimpse when her sleeves rode up or her collar shifted. I was building a record without knowing exactly what I would do with it, but something in me knew that one day this information might be important. I saw Jessica in person only a handful of times during those months, and always under circumstances controlled by Marcus. They came to my house for Thanksgiving, and Marcus was the picture of a devoted husband, refilling her wine glass, pulling out her chair, telling everyone how lucky he was to have found her. But I noticed how Jessica looked at him before she spoke, seeking permission with her eyes. I noticed how she positioned herself slightly behind him, always aware of where he was in the room. I noticed how she flinched almost imperceptibly when he put his hand on the back of her neck, a gesture that to everyone else looked affectionate, but to me looked possessive, controlling, a reminder of his power over her. At Christmas, Jessica had a new injury to explain. She told everyone she had burned her arm on the oven while cooking. The burn was on her forearm, an angry red mark that looked nothing like any cooking accident I had ever seen. It looked like someone had pressed something hot against her skin deliberately, precisely, cruelly. I said nothing because she begged me with her eyes to say nothing, and I watched my daughter spend Christmas morning performing the role of happy wife, while something inside her was slowly dying. If this story is resonating with you right now, if you are watching this and feeling your chest tighten because you recognize something in these words, I need to pause and talk to you directly for a moment. The truth is, you found this video for a reason. Maybe you are going through something similar yourself, watching someone you love disappear into a situation you cannot control. Maybe you know what it feels like to see the signs but feel powerless to help, to lie awake at night wondering if you are doing enough, if you are doing anything at all. This channel exists for moments exactly like this one. It exists because so many of us have felt this particular kind of helplessness, this specific brand of heartbreak that comes from loving someone who is being hurt. If you are finding comfort in knowing you are not alone, if this story is giving you even a small sense of validation, please consider subscribing. Every story I share is chosen because it matters, because it might be exactly what someone needs to hear at exactly the right moment. We are building a community here, a space where these difficult experiences can be witnessed and understood, and your presence in that community matters. The phone call that changed everything came on a Wednesday in April. It was late afternoon, and I was in my garden planting tulip bulbs, trying to lose myself in the simple satisfaction of putting something in the ground that would bloom into beauty. My phone rang, and when I saw Jessica's name on the screen, I felt the familiar cocktail of hope and dread that had become my constant companion. But this call was different. The moment I answered, I knew something had shifted. Jessica was crying, but not the hopeless crying I had heard before. This was the crying of someone who had finally reached the end of a very long road. She said one sentence that made my heart stop. She said, "Mom, I need help. I am ready to leave him." I was on my feet before she finished speaking, dirt still on my hands, my gardening gloves falling unnoticed to the ground. I asked her where she was. She told me she was at home, that Marcus was at work, that she had maybe 2 hours before he came back. I told her to pack one bag with essentials, her identification, any cash she could find, and to leave everything else behind. I told her I would be there in 45 minutes. I told her not to answer the phone if Marcus called, not to do anything that might alert him that something had changed. I hung up and I ran to my car faster than I had moved in years. The drive to Jessica's house in the gated community felt like it took forever, even though I was speeding the entire way. My mind raced through scenarios and possibilities, through everything that could go wrong. What if Marcus came home early? What if he had cameras in the house and was watching her pack? What if this was somehow a trap, a test he had devised to prove her disloyalty so he could punish her even more severely? But underneath all that fear was something else, something that felt almost like joy. My daughter had asked for help. After all those months of denial, all those carefully constructed lies, all those flinches and whispered pleas for me not to ask questions, she had finally broken through whatever wall Marcus had built around her and reached out to me. That meant there was still a part of her that believed she deserved better. That meant she had not been completely destroyed. The security guard at the gate of the community knew me from my previous visits, and he waved me through without asking questions. I drove through the winding streets lined with massive houses, each one a monument to wealth and privilege, each one potentially hiding secrets behind its pristine facade. When I pulled into Jessica's driveway, I saw her standing on the front porch with a single suitcase beside her. She was pale and thin, thinner than I had ever seen her, and she was wearing sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. I did not need to ask why. I got out of the car and walked toward her, and when she saw me coming, she started to cry again. I held her there on the porch of the house that was supposed to be her dream home, and I told her that everything was going to be okay, that I had her, that we were leaving and she never had to come back. We got in the car, and I started driving, not toward my house, but toward a hotel in New Jersey that I had researched months ago, a place that was far enough away to feel safe, but close enough that we could regroup and make plans. Jessica sat in the passenger seat and stared out the window, and for the first 20 minutes she did not say a word. Then, slowly, like a dam beginning to crack, she started to talk. She told me about the first time Marcus hit her, 3 days after their honeymoon ended. He had been angry about something trivial, a comment she made about the restaurant where they had dinner, and he slapped her across the face with such force that she fell against the kitchen counter and cracked her rib. She told me about how he apologized afterward, how he cried and begged for forgiveness, how he said it would never happen again. She told me about the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time, each incident worse than the last, each apology less convincing, each cycle of violence spinning faster and faster. She told me about the isolation, how Marcus had systematically cut her off from her friends by criticizing them, by making her feel guilty for spending time with anyone but him, by checking her phone and questioning every text message and social media interaction until she simply stopped reaching out to people because it was easier than dealing with his jealousy. She told me about the financial control, how Marcus had put her name on none of their joint accounts, how he gave her an allowance like she was a child, how he tracked every penny she spent and demanded explanations for anything he considered unnecessary. She told me about the psychological torture, the constant criticism of her appearance, her intelligence, her worth as a person, the way he would tell her that no one else would ever love her, that she was lucky to have him, that she should be grateful, he put up with someone so fundamentally flawed? She told me these things in a voice that started out small and grew stronger with each revelation, and by the time she finished, we were pulling into the hotel parking lot, and she was sitting up straighter, like confessing these truths had physically lifted a weight from her shoulders. We checked into the hotel under my name, paying cash so there would be no credit card trail for Marcus to follow. The room was nothing special, just 2 double beds and a television and a small bathroom, but to Jessica it was a sanctuary. She took the longest shower of her life while I sat on one of the beds and tried to process everything she had told me. The scope of what Marcus had done to her was almost incomprehensible. This was not just physical abuse, though that was horrifying enough. This was a systematic destruction of a person, a methodical dismantling of everything that made my daughter who she was. He had broken her down piece by piece, stripped her of her identity, her confidence, her connection to the outside world, until she was nothing but a hollow shell performing the role of wife while dying inside. And he had done it all behind the facade of the perfect marriage, the beautiful house, the enviable lifestyle that everyone in their social circle admired and coveted. When Jessica came out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, I could see the full extent of the damage for the first time. There were bruises in various stages of healing on her arms and shoulders, a faded yellow mark on her collarbone, scars I had never seen before on her wrists that suggested this was not the first time she had considered escape as a last resort. I looked at my daughter's body and I saw a map of suffering, a physical record of every time she had endured something no human being should ever have to endure. And that was when something inside me shifted from protective mother to something harder, something more determined. I was not just going to help my daughter escape. I was going to make sure Marcus Thompson never had the opportunity to do this to anyone ever again. Right now, you might be watching this and thinking about someone in your own life. Maybe it is your daughter, your sister, your best friend, your niece. Maybe it is someone who has started canceling plans at the last minute, whose smile does not reach their eyes anymore, who seems smaller somehow than they used to be. I need to pause here and ask you something that matters. Have you ever watched someone you love disappear into a relationship and felt powerless to pull them back? Have you ever lain awake wondering if you should say something, do something, anything, even though you know they will deny everything and push you away? If you are nodding right now, if your throat is tight because someone finally put words to the helplessness you have been carrying, I want you to know that your pain is real and your instincts are probably right. When you share your experience in the comments, even just a few words, you become part of a community of people who understand what it means to love someone from a distance while watching them suffer. Your voice might be the very thing that helps another person realize they are not alone, that they are not crazy for worrying. So please, share with us down below. Type, "I have watched someone I love disappear." That is all. Just those 7 words. And know that when you write them, you are connecting with hundreds of others who have felt exactly the same way. Thank you for being here, for bearing witness, for caring enough to stay until the end of this story. Your presence matters more than you know. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal consultations, safety planning, and emotional recovery. I had savings that Richard and I had accumulated over our lifetime together, money I had been planning to leave to Jessica in my will, and I used a significant portion of it to hire the best divorce attorney in Philadelphia. Her name was Catherine Blackwell, and she specialized in cases involving domestic violence. When we sat down with her for the first time and Jessica told her story, I watched Catherine's face carefully. She had heard stories like this before, probably hundreds of them, and yet I could still see the flicker of anger in her eyes when Jessica described some of the more severe incidents. Catherine told us that getting a divorce would be complicated because Marcos was wealthy and would have access to expensive lawyers of his own, but she also told us that in cases of documented abuse, the courts tended to favor the victim, especially when there was evidence. And that was when Catherine asked a question that changed everything. She asked if there was anyone who might have witnessed the abuse, anyone who might be willing to testify about what they had seen or heard. Jessica shook her head, and I understood why. Marcus had been careful. He never hit her in front of other people. He saved his violence for private moments behind closed doors when there were no witnesses to complicate his public image as the perfect husband. But as I sat there thinking about Catherine's question, something nagged at the back of my mind. Something Jessica had mentioned during her confession in the car, a detail that had seemed minor at the time but was now starting to feel important. She had told me that Marcus's mother, a woman named Evelyn Thompson, had visited them once during the first month of their marriage. Jessica had been covering a black eye with makeup at the time, and Evelyn had looked at her, really looked at her, and then looked away without saying a word. Jessica had interpreted this as Evelyn not caring, as further proof that she was alone in her suffering, but I wondered if that interpretation was correct. I wondered if maybe, just maybe, Evelyn had looked away not because she did not care, but because she could not face what she was seeing. I wondered if perhaps there was a history here, a pattern that extended beyond my daughter. That night, after Jessica had fallen asleep in our hotel room, I made a decision that would either help my daughter or make things immeasurably worse. I was going to call Evelyn Thompson. I had her phone number from the wedding planning process, saved in my contacts from a conversation we had about seating arrangements. I remembered her as a quiet, elegant woman who seemed perpetually nervous, who deferred to her husband Gerald on even the smallest decisions, who had a way of smiling that never quite masked the sadness in her eyes. At the time, I had attributed her demeanor to being wealthy and reserved, a different species from my middle-class self. But now I was looking at those memories through a different lens. I was seeing a woman who flinched slightly when her husband raised his voice at a vendor. I was seeing a woman who had excused herself to the bathroom multiple times during a planning meeting and come back with red-rimmed eyes. I was seeing a woman who might understand exactly what my daughter had been through because she might have been through it herself. I looked at the clock. It was after 11 at night, too late to call anyone under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. I went into the bathroom, closed the door, sat down on the edge of the tub, and dialed Evelyn Thompson's number before I could talk myself out of it. The phone rang 4 times, and I was preparing to leave a voicemail when suddenly there was a click and a voice that sounded both surprised and frightened said, "Hello." I introduced myself, and there was a pause so long that I thought she might have hung up. Then Evelyn said something that made my hands start shaking. She said I was wondering when you would call. Evelyn told me she could not talk long, that Gerald was asleep, but was a light sleeper, that she had to be careful. But in the 10 minutes we spoke, she confirmed everything I had suspected and more. Marcos had grown up watching his father abuse his mother. He had learned at Gerald's knee that women were property, that violence was power, that love meant control. Evelyn had stayed for 40 years because she was afraid, because Gerald controlled all the money, because she had nowhere to go and no one who would believe her over her successful, charming husband. She told me she had prayed that Marcus would be different, that breaking the cycle was possible, but she had seen signs even when he was a teenager that the poison had taken root. She told me about Marcus's first girlfriend in college, a girl named Amanda who had transferred schools suddenly in the middle of her junior year and refused to say why. She told me about another woman Marcus had dated briefly before Jessica, a woman who had filed a police report that was mysteriously dismissed when the Thompson family lawyers got involved. Each piece of information Evelyn gave me was another brick in the wall of evidence we were building, another confirmation that my daughter had not been Marcus's first victim and, if we did not stop him, would not be his last. Before we hung up, I asked Evelyn if she would be willing to help us, to provide testimony or documentation or anything that might strengthen Jessica's case. There was another long pause, and I could hear the fear in her breathing. Then she said something that broke my heart. She said, "I have been waiting 40 years for someone to ask me that question." She said yes. The next several months were a legal battle unlike anything I had ever experienced. Marcus, predictably, did not react well when he received the divorce papers. He showed up at my house in the middle of the night, pounding on the door and screaming Jessica's name, and I had to call the police to have him removed. He hired the most expensive lawyers money could buy and launched a campaign to destroy Jessica's credibility, painting her as mentally unstable, as a gold digger who had invented stories of abuse to get a better settlement. He manipulated mutual friends into taking his side, turning people Jessica had thought cared about her into character witnesses for her abuser. He filed counterclaims and motions and appeals, using every legal tool available to drag out the process and drain our resources. But Catherine Blackwell was worth every penny I paid her. She anticipated each of Marcus's moves and countered them with surgical precision. She subpoenaed records that Marcus had tried to hide, including medical reports from a hospital visit where Jessica had been treated for cracked ribs and a concussion. She found the police report that Amanda had filed years ago and had it unsealed, and she arranged for Evelyn Thompson to give a deposition that was so devastating, so filled with decades of witnessed abuse and family secrets, that Marcus's lawyers requested a recess halfway through and never quite recovered their momentum. The day the divorce was finalized was one of the best days of my life. The judge granted Jessica full dissolution of the marriage and awarded her a settlement that would allow her to start over without financial worry. More importantly, the judge issued a permanent restraining order against Marcus, citing the extensive evidence of physical and emotional abuse. As we walked out of the courthouse, Jessica turned to me and said something that I carry with me to this day. She said, "Mom, you saved my life." I shook my head because it was not true. I told her that she had saved her own life the moment she found the courage to call me and ask for help. I was just there to catch her when she was ready to fall. We held each other on those courthouse steps while strangers walked past us on their way to their own legal battles, their own family dramas, their own moments of crisis and resolution. And then we went home, not to the house in the gated community that had been her prison, but to my house, the house where she had grown up, where she was safe, where the healing could finally begin. If you have been watching this story and feeling something stir inside you, if this narrative is helping you see your own life or someone else's life more clearly, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that. Transformation is possible. Change is real. The patterns we think will define us forever can be broken when we find the courage to reach for help and the luck to have someone reach back. This channel exists because stories like Jessica's need to be told, not for entertainment, but for connection, for validation, for the simple reassurance that we are not alone in our struggles. Every time you subscribe, every time you share these stories with someone who might need to hear them, you are participating in something meaningful. You are helping to build a community where difficult truths can be spoken and where healing can happen. If this story has touched you, consider subscribing and joining us. Together, we are stronger than any of us are alone. The aftermath of the divorce was a long, slow process of rebuilding. Jessica moved back into her childhood bedroom, and for the first few months, she rarely left the house. The trauma of what she had experienced did not disappear just because the legal battle was over. She had nightmares. She flinched at loud noises. She would sometimes freeze in the middle of a conversation, her eyes going distant, lost in memories she was trying to process. I found a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, and Jessica started attending sessions twice a week. It was hard work, the kind of emotional excavation that leaves you exhausted and raw, but slowly, inch by inch, I watched my daughter start to come back to herself. She reconnected with old friends who had been pushed away during her marriage. She started reading again, devouring books about psychology and healing and women who had survived impossible situations. She began taking long walks in the neighborhood, reclaiming her ability to move through the world without fear. And one day, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, she came downstairs with a light in her eyes that I had not seen since before she met Marcus. She told me she had decided to go back to school. She wanted to become a counselor, to help other women who had been through what she had been through. She wanted to transform her pain into purpose, to make sure that her suffering meant something. I cried when she told me that. Not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming pride and gratitude. My daughter had been broken down to nothing by a man who wanted to own her, and she had risen from the ashes of that destruction with a vision of how to turn her worst experience into a gift for others. That is the thing about resilience that no one tells you. It is not about bouncing back to who you were before. It is about becoming someone new, someone stronger, someone forged in fire, who understands the value of light precisely because they have lived in the darkness. Jessica enrolled in a master's program in counseling psychology at a university in Philadelphia, and she threw herself into her studies with a passion I had never seen in her before. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who had needed a man's approval to feel worthy. She was a survivor, a warrior, a woman who knew exactly how much she could endure and had chosen to use that knowledge to help others. Evelyn Thompson and I stayed in touch after the trial. She had paid a price for her testimony. Gerald had been furious when he learned what she had done, and their marriage, already a hollow shell of fear and control, had finally ended. At 72 years old, Evelyn found herself divorced and alone for the first time in her life. But she told me that she had never felt freer. She moved into a small apartment near her sister, a sister she had been forbidden to see for decades, because Gerald considered her a bad influence. She started going to church again, something Gerald had discouraged because he did not like her having any community outside of his control. She told me that watching Jessica stand up to Marcus had given her the courage to finally stand up to Gerald, that she wished she had done it decades ago, but was grateful she had done it at all. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for each other is simply to show that escape is possible, that there is life on the other side of fear. Marcus Thompson did not fare as well as his victims in the aftermath of the divorce. The publicity surrounding the case, which Catherine had strategically leaked to local journalists, had damaged his reputation in ways that his family's money could not repair. His business partners began distancing themselves from him. His social circle, the wealthy elite who had once admired his success and charm, started declining his invitations and whispering about him at parties. I heard through various channels that he had started drinking heavily, that his temper had become even more volatile, that he had been asked to resign from the country club where he and Jessica had been married. I cannot say I felt sorry for him. There is a particular kind of justice in watching an abuser face consequences, in seeing the social capital they accumulated through charm and manipulation stripped away piece by piece. It does not undo the damage they caused, but it provides a certain satisfaction to know that the mask they wore so carefully has finally slipped, revealing the monster underneath. Jessica graduated from her counseling program 3 years after her divorce. I sat in the audience at her graduation ceremony, watching her walk across the stage in her cap and gown, and I thought about everything she had been through to get to this moment. I thought about the girl she had been before Marcus, bright and hopeful and eager to love. I thought about the woman she had become during her marriage, diminished and afraid and lost. And I thought about the woman standing on that stage, receiving her degree to thunderous applause, a survivor who had transformed her pain into purpose. She was not the same person she had been before the abuse. She could never be that person again. But the person she had become was remarkable in ways that the old Jessica could never have imagined. She had depth now, wisdom that comes only from suffering. She had compassion that was bone deep, empathy born from knowing exactly what it feels like to be alone in your pain. She had strength that she did not know she possessed until it was tested. She had emerged from the fire not unscathed, but unbowed, not unchanged, but unbroken. As I finish telling you this story, I want to share something that Jessica wrote in the acknowledgments section of her master's thesis. She wrote about me, about the phone call I made to Evelyn that night after she begged me not to ask questions. She wrote that I had trusted my instincts over her protests, that I had refused to look away when it would have been easier to believe the lies, that I had been willing to fight for her even when she did not have the strength to fight for herself. She wrote that my persistence had saved her life. I read those words and I cried, and then I called her and told her the truth. The truth is that I made that phone call not because I was brave or selfless or had some special insight. I made it because I was her mother, and mothers do whatever it takes to protect their children, even when those children are grown women with their own lives and mistakes and secrets. I made it because I could not bear to watch her suffer one more day without doing something, anything, to try to help. I made it because 40 years ago, a woman lived 3 houses down from me, and everyone knew what was happening to her, and no one did anything, and she died. I was not going to let that happen to my daughter. I was not going to be another person who looked away. If you have stayed with me through this entire story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. These stories matter because they remind us that we are not alone, that our struggles are shared, that transformation is possible even when everything feels hopeless. If you have found value here, if something in this narrative has spoken to your own experience, please subscribe to this channel. Every story I share is chosen because it might be the story that someone needs to hear, the story that gives them a permission to ask for help, the story that reminds them that they deserve to be treated with dignity and love. We are building something here, a community of survivors and supporters, and people who refuse to look away from difficult truths. Your subscription helps us reach more people who need these stories. Your presence in our community makes us all stronger. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Today, Jessica runs a private counseling practice that specializes in helping survivors of domestic violence. She has a small office in downtown Philadelphia, decorated with soft colors and comfortable furniture and art that speaks to healing and hope. She sees clients 5 days a week, women and men who come to her broken and leave a little more whole each time. She trains other counselors in trauma-informed approaches, gives talks at conferences, has written articles that have been published in professional journals. She got remarried 2 years ago to a man named David, who treats her like the treasure she is, who understands her past and loves her, not in spite of it, but because of how it shaped her. They have a daughter now, my granddaughter, a beautiful girl named Hope, who is 4 years old and has her mother's eyes. When I watch Jessica with Hope, when I see the love and patience and respect she shows her child, I know that the cycle has been broken. Hope will grow up knowing what healthy love looks like. She will learn that she is worthy of kindness and respect. She will never have to wonder if she deserves to be hurt, because her mother will teach her through every word and action that she deserves only to be cherished. I am 73 now, and I do not know how many years I have left on this earth. But I know that whatever time I have will be spent watching my daughter thrive, playing with my granddaughter, and sharing stories like this one in the hope that they might help someone else. The day my daughter came home beaten and begged me not to ask questions, I made a choice. I chose to trust my instincts over her protests. I chose to make a phone call that could have gone wrong in 1,000 ways. I chose to fight for her even when she could not fight for herself. That choice cost me money and stress and sleepless nights. It nearly cost me my relationship with my daughter, who was angry at me for months before she understood why I had done what I did. But it was the right choice. It was the only choice I could live with. And if you are reading this and you are in a similar situation, watching someone you love disappear into the grip of an abuser, I want you to know that you are not powerless. You cannot force them to leave. You cannot make decisions for them. But you can refuse to pretend that everything is fine. You can refuse to be complicit in the silence that protects abusers. You can be there, consistently and persistently, letting them know that when they are ready, you will help them escape. And when they finally make that call, when they finally say they are ready, you move heaven and earth to catch them. That is what love looks like. That is what mothers do. That is what saved my daughter's life. I started this story by telling you that my daughter came home bruised and broken and begged me not to ask questions. But that is not where the story ends. The story ends with my daughter standing in her own light, healed and whole, and helping others find their way out of the darkness. The story ends with a granddaughter named Hope, who will never know what it feels like to be afraid of the person who is supposed to love her. The story ends with a mother who trusted her instincts, made a phone call, and refused to look away. If there is anyone listening who needs to hear this, please know that your story does not have to end in the darkness either. There is light waiting for you. There are people who will help you find it. All you have to do is reach out your hand and let someone catch you. My daughter did that 5 years ago, and today she is living proof that transformation is possible, that healing is real, that even the deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest strength. Thank you for listening to our story. I hope it gives you hope.